Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. I'm Chris Muntz and this is episode 70, Legitimate Love and Suffering in the Music Classroom with Dr. Ryan Board. Now, don't go running off because of the emo-sounding title of this episode. It's actually really quite uplifting. In fact, I would describe this episode as a very important advocacy episode. People need to understand and they need to know, the people who make decisions about creating choral opportunities for students and for adults in our world, they need to know the power and the magic that we hold in our hands as choral directors in shaping the lives of our singers, our students in particular. In this episode, Dr. Ryan Board from Pepperdine University and I discussed the role we see for choral music education in filling the void of the psychological and emotional development in young people and adults. There is an epidemic of the loss of resiliency and mental health issues in young people that is changing over the last 10 years. It's not a normal curve when you look at those things, and this has been well documented. Dr. Board walks us through the work of psychiatrist M. Peck by finding parallels between Dr. Peck's prescriptions for building a healthy mind and what we already do in a choral environment. He was noticing as reading this book that the things that Dr. Peck outlines in his book for how to build that healthy, resilient mind are things that we already do. And so he's going to walk through all of those. And the fact the slides for his presentation that he did at Choralosophy Convention on this topic are in the show notes. So make sure you check in. If you're visual, you can kind of walk through the slide presentation as we talk about this. It's not going to be, it's heavy material, but you are not going to want to miss this, and you're going to want to listen all the way through to the end. Just a bit of housekeeping. I'm going to be taking a break from interviews in July, but don't fear, you are going to continue to get podcasts throughout the summer. I am doing a whole bunch of recording in June, like a lot, so that I can have some content as we take about a month-long road trip. We're going to head out west from Kansas City and drive through Seattle, or out to Seattle, back through Idaho, South Dakota, just going to do quite a long camping and road trip. And so my plan is to have all the material I need already done and before we head out of town. So you're going to not even realize that I'm gone, and you'll continue to get great conversations. All right, everybody, I am here with Dr. Ryan Board, and Ryan is one of my old professors and mentor and friend, and he gave a great session at the Choralosophy Convention that I just think needs to be a podcast. So we're going to talk about the fact that choir has a magic power, and that choir has this magic power that's unique in that it can give students, singers, young people, adults, everyone that does it, this really amazing insight into themselves through exploring love, suffering, loss, pain, joy, all the different emotions that we just don't quite get to try on in the same way in other activities. So I'm excited to dive into this. Dr. Board, welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
This is going to be fun. So first, before we dive into the meaty bits of this conversation, let's just fill the audience in on who you are. So give us the 60-second bio of where do you come from, but really start out. I'd like for you to go all the way back to just why you got into choir in the first place. What was your spark?
Okay, well, I'm originally from Idaho, Pacific Northwestern boy, and I had the privilege of growing up in one of those big church music programs. The music directors were from Westminster Choir College, sort of one of those more traditional liturgically based choral programs, directed by really awesome music educators who taught me a lot about music history and high quality music. And so from a young age, starting at 3, I was singing really high quality music in church, and then also great music education systems in the Boise Public Schools. And went to the University of Northern Colorado originally to study kind of vocal jazz, and got into music education. Went back to Idaho and taught junior high for a couple of years, and then got recruited to Westminster and studied there with Andrew McGill and Joseph Flemmerfelt, and then moved to the University of Missouri, Kansas City to pursue the doctorate. And then through a unique turn of events there, got to hold a visiting position while they searched for the endowed chair position. Was there for 4 years, and then landed the job at Pepperdine University, where I am currently. And married to Ida Nicolosi, and have 2 awesome kids, 2 boys.
That's awesome. And so how many years now at Pepperdine? Is it Is it 10 yet?
So I'm just completing my 11th year actually.
Oh,
It's
wow.
been that long. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, and doing some awesome stuff there. So actually, that's a good segue. The Pepperdine thing is a segue because this conversation that we're going to walk through is kind of a brainchild of a course you're taking, or from a course that you're teaching at Pepperdine. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So at Pepperdine, like at a lot of universities, I'm teaching a first year seminar. Pepperdine offers this experience in order to help students make the adjustment into college life. It covers some basic things like what does it mean to be a scholar? What does it mean to search for truth and be a sort of a researcher of integrity to cite sources? How do you write? How do you think deeply about some enduring questions? And so, we'll take one book, we'll focus on a book, and we just cover a host of things that help students transition into college life.
And it is not a music class.
Well, no, although professors who teach a first year seminar get to choose a topic as like a lens through which to view all that material. And so,
Oh,
of
okay.
course, mine has been titled A Life in Music. And so we use music as a way to look at a lot of these things.
Okay, so that's interesting. So you have not all of your students in that class, the seminar class, are music students, but you're allowed to kind of make it your own in the sense that, hey, I'm a music professor, and so I'm going to speak to you in my language, but I'm going to make it apply to all of your lives in some way.
Yeah, so these are majors and non-majors. It's a mixed course.
Got it. Okay. So tell us about this idea of, in fact, the session that you gave is called Legitimate Love and Suffering. First of all, could you tell us what it means for love and suffering to be legitimate?
Okay. It's a little bit of unpacking to do here, but and perhaps as we continue to talk through the session, I can unpack it a little bit more. But the idea is that there are certain things in sort of the social construct of the society that we live in culture, and all the ways in which we engage our culture and each other that have limited, particularly for our young people, the ability to engage in activities that help them understand what it means to suffer legitimately and love legitimately. And by suffering legitimately, we mean those things that actually present them with problems. They suffer, but then they solve them. And then by solving them, they grow.
Hmm.
And so a lot of the kinds of suffering, I would posit, and again, I need to say at the outset, I am not a psychologist. And so I want to point that out, but this is through some deep thinking related through music and through teaching this course. I would posit that students are met with a lot of things that cause them to suffer, but because of social media and other things, they don't get to solve the problems that they meet along the way, and then therefore they don't grow because of this. On the love end, I would say that culturally as well, they have what I would call sort of an immature view of what love is, a very surfacey picture, and don't have a lot of experiences in which to engage the kind of love that comes through suffering, in which they really grow and develop spiritually.
Right. Yeah, that all makes sense. And I did a little bit of homework myself before we talked, because of course you're basing a lot of this stuff in this course. I remember from the session on an M. Scott Peck book called "The Road Less Traveled." I want to say that's
Correct.
correct.
Yes.
And so I actually have this up here on my screen of what he says, or how he, kind of a synopsis of how he describes legitimate suffering and legitimate love, which to me made a lot of sense when I read it, because it's almost as if the word legitimate in this context is more like a verb, meaning the suffering, you legitimate the suffering by going through what he calls those 4 acts of discipline, which I know we're going to talk about later. But it's we legitimate the suffering by giving it the time that it needs for us to work through the problems. And so I think some people might hear this. People have the habit of like reading my posters for the episodes and deciding that it's going to be about horrible things. And people might say legitimate suffering, and it's, oh, as it like, so you're saying my suffering's illegitimate? Do you get to decide that my suffering is legitimate or illegitimate? And I don't think that's what he means. I think that he means that there is a way in which we legitimate our suffering. And I think you're exactly right that the social media aspect for young people is inhibiting that, for a lot of reasons, which I'm sure we'll dig into. But I just wanted to give that context because I think that's an important frame to look at it. Is that one person's one person's stubbed toe is another person's you know spear through the chest. Like it's a little bit subjective, but there is still a process that he's outlining here to go through. Does that sound like stuff that you found in his book?
Yeah, so the I recommend this book. He really beautifully and deeply and carefully outlines really tough subjects. I mean, he talks about how if he's going to try to get into the defining love, he's really getting into one of the great mysteries of the universe. And so he doesn't claim to be able to define these things completely, but he helps his readers on a journey to sort of understanding where we get sort of disillusioned and where there are some truths or some universal profundities, if I can sort of make up a word there. But um, and so I would agree with you what you said. Suffering is universal, and yet we sometimes have a tendency to think that our suffering is more unique than it is, perhaps.
Uh-huh. Yep. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way of putting it is with social media though moves so fast. And I think this is the important thing to kind of get before we really dive into this, the kind of the why behind this project you're doing with your students. But uh, so social media takes our suffering and of course it freezes it in time. So this is kind of a weird thought, but let's say I have something horrible happen in my life and I post it online and I tell the story and I post it online. Well, the story then stays as it is. It gets memed, right? So every time somebody shares it, every time somebody comments on it, they're commenting on that moment of my suffering as it was in that one moment. And so I think people tend to then stay in that moment, right, rather than and of course, this is a vast oversimplification, but I'm trying to illustrate what I think happens, which is that we get stuck in that moment because it got frozen in time, it got shared around. We start to identify with the response we get from that sharing, and then, as Dr. Peck would say in this book, it looks like then we don't move through those phases of discipline to get to solve the problem as easily as readily. And so I think that's going on. And I wonder if, because that actually is going to segue into my next question, because in your presentation, you had some slides that kind of related to why you chose this book and this project because of things you were noticing in your students. Can we talk more about that first before we go on?
Sure. Well, it's my students, and it's the information that I think a lot of us are receiving, kind of through the psychologists and the psychiatrists and the science about our students' inability to cope. Or right now, the buzzword is resiliency, that there's a lack of resiliency among our young people. And again, I am not as connected to what's going on in the high schools, but I bet folks are noticing that there as well. But at the college level, there are some pretty fascinating numbers that are coming out. I think here at Pepperdine, they're talking about how many times over compared to 10 years ago that students are requesting access to the counseling center. And it's part of it is good. Part of it is that some of the taboo nature of reaching out for help has gone away, and that students are understanding this is a good thing. If I need help, I can reach out. But I think what folks are discovering is that there are a lot of things that students are reaching out and asking for help for that wouldn't be necessarily categorized as any kind of a catastrophe or drastic need. In other words, it's okay, there's a grasshopper in my room and it's scaring me to death, or my roommate called me a name and I don't know how to handle it, so I'm calling the counseling center. In other words, some of these things that that students perhaps would have been able to work out on their own earlier, they're having a harder time with. And so in this book, The Road Less Traveled, one of the reasons I chose it was I wanted to just see how my students would engage subject matter that had to deal with this concept of what does it mean to suffer? Why is suffering good? is it something that rather than seeing it as something that's bad, that you can embrace and choose, in fact, to almost turn on its end and make it something that you look forward to? And that's one of the positions of this book, that anytime you're suffering, you're growing. And so even though it hurts, there's a part of you that can acknowledge that, and in fact, that it can bring some positive feelings.
Right, absolutely. And you referenced the high school level, and of course, yes, I see that as well. Changes over, the 18 years that I've been teaching. It's definitely different now than it was at the beginning. And you're right, though, it's tricky to talk about this because it is a mixed bag. Meaning there is a good aspect of it too. In other words, we love that there is less stigma around kids asking for help for mental health issues, asking for being more open with kind of sharing about their life circumstances, all of those types of things. But a good way to think of this, and these are just made up numbers, but if I think about like out of 100 kids, if you've got 10 that are willing to go seek help now that weren't 15 years ago, that's great. That's 10 more kids that are getting help that wouldn't have otherwise gotten. But if with that 10 comes along 100 kids that really don't need help but are asking anyway, then you kind of have this two steps forward, one step back kind of thing going on. And I think that's again ties into the social media aspect of it, is that tends to amplify because there are social contagions involved in that. And again, we talk about the attention seeking, and there, so all of that plays in with it too. You can't just talk about the good things with it. You have to also acknowledge the bad things. So I'm also interested too in what you said about you know the what rises to the level of what calling the counseling center, calling the campus police. Those types of things are interesting to me too, because one of the things that we are hearing a lot nowadays is that well, we hear the word trauma a lot more than we used to, right? We hear crisis a lot more than we used to. um, and what's interesting to me though is that trauma is one of my pet peeve words, because I had a lot of childhood traumas that I dealt with, and trauma in the clinical sense. um, and that's the thing that is a pet peeve for me, is because trauma does have a clinical definition. Simply saying that one is traumatized does not make them actually traumatized. There are criteria for that. One interesting thing about the Choralosophy podcast is that it is completely independently produced, meaning there is no organization, no institution, no foundation behind this show or behind this production. There's no company, nothing. It's all supported by listeners and listener involvement. The most direct way that you can do that is through Patreon. At patreon.com/Choralosophy, you can join a subscribers only environment where I put extra content, meaning a behind the scenes episode every month, supplemental materials. The people on the Patreon get to see who's coming on the show ahead of time, which means they can put bugs in my ear ahead of time about what I should ask the person about. All kinds of fun perks. There's even an awesome Choralosophy hat and t-shirt. There's all kinds of fun ways to do that over at Patreon. Now, it's an important thing, because if you enjoy this show, a couple thousand or so people that tune in on a regular basis to this show, if 10% of you were to join the Patreon, it would change the game for my ability to make this production better and better over the course of the next year. So producers, there is a producer level that you can opt into over there as well. The Patreon producers are Ulrika Igrain Munoz Alarcon, Chandler Smith, David Kowalczyk, Kyle Peterson, Michael Herron, Ryan Main, and Stephen Kathy Kakachik. And so I wonder if that's something that plays into what you're seeing too, and what you're discussing here is just the idea, the difference between self-reporting of trauma crisis versus legitimate actual trauma crisis.
I think you're right, and that's a good transition. Not really a transition, but an opportunity to bring up a critical point, and that is, again, as I said, I am not a psychologist. This
Mhm.
book was also written back in the 1970s, and so maybe that matters, maybe it doesn't. But one of the things he says in the book is that this avoidance of suffering, this being presented with a problem and wanting to not go through it, to experience the pain and grow from it, he states in the book that it is the root cause of all mental illness. And so we have to be careful with that. I think, we acknowledge that there are genetic things, there are mental pathologies, but I think what he's really talking about are sort of the neuroses and the character disorder types of things, the things that are environmental, the pressures that are put on us, that are caused by problem avoidance, that he says eventually cause a lot of the things that we're probably seeing in our students.
Right. It sounds like he's referencing kind of the things that would fall under the umbrella of cognitive behavioral therapy type treatments and issues, right? So,
Perhaps, yeah.
so you're talking about things that can be dealt with changes in mindset, changes in approach, which he would be right. I think, I'm not a psychiatrist either, but I read a lot, and he would still be right today in that sense if he's talking about those types of psychological issues that are cognitive behavioral related. Of course, now in 2020, we also know that there are certain neurological things, neurodivergence of different ways your brain functions that are not really in somebody's control. So I think you're right to point that out, that would be a distinction that would be important if he's going to say that all psychological problems are due to that. Um, he probably would no longer say that. I'm going to guess.
I would agree. He has a statement in there, and let me just get it exactly right. I have the book here because I was going to want to probably say something from it. So right here at the beginning, this is an incredible statement. So, in the succinctly elegant words of Carl Jung, okay, neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering, which is kind of an impactful statement, I think.
Yes, in fact, I saw that in the reading I was doing too, where, and I'm going to put it in a context here too, because when I was talking about earlier, the idea of thinking of legitimate as a verb rather than legitimate suffering, is that he says that Jung said that neurosis is a substitute for legitimate suffering, and then Peck used that quote to kind of name what he calls neurotic suffering, which is when you suffer but avoid those steps like delaying gratification, acceptance of responsibility, balancing
Right.
your life, those types of things. And what someone will get when they avoid those steps is that neurotic suffering. And so it's kind of when you don't legitimate, it becomes neurotic, which is just, of course, these are buzzwords for psychiatrists, I guess, but I think that puts it in a context that most people could understand. So I'm going to jump back into your presentation here because I think
Sure.
you had some interesting little blurbs here. I'm just going to read from. So you had thinking about resiliency at the college level, and I will say that when you did this at the presentation, I was thinking about the high school context and noticing a lot of these same things. But just referencing emergency calls to the counseling center, which you mentioned, that have doubled in the last 5 years. Needy students have shaped the landscape, meaning that's absorbing more of our time than it ever has before. And again, I think that falls into the mixed bag category. Some of that's good because some of our students need more help than other kids, and that part's good. But it's a mixed bag. Students are afraid to fail. That's not a mixed bag. I think that's very harmful. That's just my opinion. Faculty feels pressure to exceed lest they get lower teacher ratings. You can talk to us about that because that's less of a deal for me. Students are uncomfortable with not being right. And then we've got the helicopter institutions, the helicopter parents. At the university level, I'm sure you would agree, just giant ballooning administrations that are always needing to be in the kids' business and keep the customers happy, and all of that kind of stuff. All right, so which of those jump out to you as the most significant?
This needy students have shaped the landscape. I think that's clearly one of the big ones. So there's a lot of effort in trying to help students make the adjustment to college life now that they're under some of the things that were providing them perhaps some scaffolding or protection in their former environment, whether it was parents, whether it was some other institutional setup, whether a school or something else. And they come and they're on their own and they're faced with problems that my hunch is that somehow they were avoiding or someone else was solving on their behalf. and they literally perhaps haven't developed the skills. And so this becomes a part of our focus. And colleges and universities, we obviously we want to help students succeed. Our Their success is our success. We're interested in making sure that they come in through the door and they leave having grown in all ways possible. And so we're very interested in helping with this, but I would suggest that the resources used to help them are pretty significant. And as indicated in the slides, these things have changed the landscape in higher education.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's the mixed bag thing I was pointing out too, in that if we're talking about needy student in an academic context, meaning they have a learning need. Well, I want myself as an educator to devote more of my time to helping that kid. But if we're talking about needy as in kid just doesn't want to learn to solve his problems, then that's a very different kind of bag. And I think right now we're struggling as an education community more broadly to distinguish those. We're having trouble either having the courage to distinguish it or the knowledge, the expertise to distinguish it. These lines are becoming blurry.
Yeah, and I think so. This is probably a good opportunity for me to kind of reference back to how my presentation kind of started, the pitch I gave,
Yes, please
and
do.
how this ultimately ties into kind of the choral classroom. Because Pepperdine brought in David Brooks, and this funny moment that I talked about. David Brooks is a political commentator who writes for the New York Times, but he's in this unique position because he's more conservative, but he's writing for a newspaper that's known as being a little bit more liberal. So he's a guy who creates a lot of great discussion and more of exactly what our country needs. Some people willing to sort of stir it up, but have conversations that are important, and to not always just go and talk to the people they're cozy talking with, right? So he's at Pepperdine, and somebody asked him at the end of his presentation, what is it that needs to change in our education systems? What are the questions that we're not asking? And his response sort of shocked us all, because he said, well, for me, I wish somebody had taught me how to pick a life partner. And we didn't sort of see that coming. But as I stopped to reflect on his point, what I took from that was that education systems have gotten so focused on sort of the rubrics, outcome based, like we want students to cover, reading, writing, arithmetic, and we have the rubrics and the tests, and it's all output, and yet we're sort of missing some whole person development things. And I in jest at the conference, I talked about how the education system has a hard time dealing with profound and intimate subjects, because nowadays, especially, they're politically charged. So if you want to talk about things that divulge more into the spiritual, or for example, you can take sex education, right? They have everybody dances around sex education a lot, because in the past, things that dealt with the spiritual world, or how you dealt with talking about sex and marriage and all this stuff, was left to the home and to the church. Or that the village, and this was the point that I made, that the village mentality has been sort of fading into the background in American society. And the village used to take care of a lot of this. The community that gathered, that suffered together, that laughed together, that built together, that did all these things together and talked about these profound things outside of school, has faded into the background. The pressure has been put on school to cover these bases. And what has happened is that nobody's doing it very well anymore. And so then add on to that the fact that students are going to go, or young people are going to go and spend up to, according to the scientists and the research, it's about 8 hours average per day on their social media devices, which, if you think about it, is half the waking hours of an individual looking at a phone. That is what has become their village.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is their, and it's kind of a toxic psychoscape, where, as you pointed out, you meander around, not really being able to actually go anywhere. And you don't meet problems that you can solve. And so what happens then when you don't have some of these social and cultural constructs in place that used to really help students deal with some of the real deep and profound? And of course, that's what was sort of bringing us towards the talking about the choral rehearsal
Right.
classroom.
Yeah, which I want to get to next. There's a couple observations there that I think are
Sure.
important. So, it's the idea that community, which you just described, the concept of community, used to be a geographical thing, and we no longer think of community. When we say the word community, we don't mean geographical. We mean the people who are like us.
Mm,
And of
yeah,
course, the problem with that, of course, is that you could include lots and lots of people in your community using that definition that you will never meet in your entire life. In your entire life, you will live the entire time on the planet. You will die with ever not ever seeing that person or with being 100 miles from that person, but you will think of them as your community.
exactly.
While the neighbor that is right next to you might never join you for a meal. And so we've kind of flipped our sense of community in that way. And so that's kids, I think, we're not adapted for that. And so we're trying to figure out how to do that. Now, the good news, at least one thing I see as good news, is kids I've noticed in the last 5 or 6 years are actually better at that than one would. This may be the high school teacher being optimistic here, but I've got more students in the last 5 or 6 years who will tell me how frequently they just turn off their phone or just don't have that social media app anymore because it's toxic. And that didn't happen 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it was brand new and everybody was doing it. And now it's relatively normal that I have a kid. Well, yeah, I just don't use those. It just stresses me out. So I don't use it. And I'm like, oh, cool. So maybe there's an adaptation happening. So I just thought I'd point that out. But then the other thing that's interesting about that too is that you mentioned the oh no, I'm going to blank. That's okay. I'll cut that part out. So let's actually take it into the let's take it into the choir classroom. How does this apply to us? And what I get the sense we're going to swoop in and save the day here. That's what we get to do.
Yeah, so that's the fun way to put it. Obviously, it's not quite like that, but what I would like to suggest is that the choral classroom, or at least the music classroom, and some unique elements of the choral classroom specifically, provide a really sacred and profound space that is missing almost everywhere else, maybe even outside of school. So maybe students are missing it at home. If they go to church, they're missing it at church. They can't find it on the football team. They can't, they certainly don't find it on social media. And so what are those things? We can talk to the audience here about that, but I think I'll start off by saying that as I was reading the central tenets of the thesis points in M. Scott Peck's book, in a number of places, I started to see this correlation between the things that he was talking about that were missing, in other words, for students to be able to grow as a human being. And yet I was sort of discovering and thinking of my own experience as a musician in ensemble music making and seeing that these things are very much there and provided richly. And so that was kind of where I started taking this and developing this idea is wow. I mean, of course, I'm biased. I think what we do is pretty special. We come into the room, we create art, we do it as a group, all those things that we know. But to see it through the lens of this book on suffering and how we're missing out on legitimate suffering, and in our search for what really matters, I was struck by the fact that a lot of these things are quite present in the choral rehearsal room and in choral performance.
Hmm. Yeah, I think you mentioned in the session, which I thought was really good, which is that in choral music, we don't necessarily have to experience the suffering directly in all the cases. We get to try it on. We get to
Right.
experiment with the emotions. So like maybe say a poet has written something gut-wrenching about a suffering time in their life. We don't actually have to experience it, but we get to try on that emotion. We get to live with it for a significant amount of time as we rehearse the piece over weeks or months or whatever it is. And we've really started to empathize. And I think that's really the empathy is the key word that we get to develop in choral music. We get to empathize with people from across time, across continents, and live in their skin, live in their shoes for some period of time, and then take it off and try on other things.
Right. Yeah. So you're kind of poking at these transitional moments in life. M. Scott Peck says the spiritually developed person, or the person who matures appropriately through their life, transitions through certain phases of suffering, sort of letting go. And of course, the final one, of course, is letting go of life itself, the acceptance of death. But there are these transitional points through life, and we can come back to some of these, but take, for example, a piece that a lot of people know. So Eliza Gillickson's Requiem,
Oh yeah. Hmm.
right? So here's a great piece. It's about originally written for the tsunami in the South Pacific that killed a number of people, a very tragic event. So there's this theologian from Emory University who writes a lot about music and theology, but people who love Bach and theology know Robin Lever. Robin Lever is kind of one of the primary researchers in all things related to Bach and theology. And a bunch of his peers got together and wrote some essays and sort of dedicatory essays to him in a book. And this theologian, Don Saliers, I think is how you pronounce his name, Dr. Saliers, wrote this great essay about how, you know, beauty, the opposite of beauty is not ugliness. I mean, it's hard. We have trouble defining beauty. Beauty is another one of these enduring questions. What is beauty? Like, what is truth and what is love, and etc. But we tend to quickly define the opposite of beauty as ugliness, and he says no, it's actually terror.
Mm.
And that when we participate in the singing of a piece like the Gillickson Requiem, we're allowing ourselves in to the terror of that moment. We're participating in a group ensemble setting, and we're creating beauty, and that beauty somehow commingles, even though we see those maybe as diametrically opposed. It's not that simple. It's that somehow the two sort of orbit each other, are interrelated, and that this profound human understanding of beauty and terror and all the broad spectrum of human experiences between those two things can be found in this really profound way through the process of singing, so that a group singing together and experiencing that text and understanding what it's about comes to an understanding of that terror. And those channels of understanding are opened and kept fresh, so that when students go out then and do experience some things in life that are tough, having dealt with it in that special community, in that space, in that artistic rendering of beauty and terror combined, they have better tools. They experience it with more maturity, with more grace. They are better at handling it, better at communicating about it, better at being a shoulder to lean on with peers who are experiencing it. So there's all these wonderful things that are in this essay about that I find really profound.
Did you know that the Choralosophy podcast is entirely listener supported? So the way you support as a listener the show is by a win-win scenario, which is just the ideal situation. It's win-win, which means that if you get a discount, I get kickback. That's how it all works, right? So that's listener supported, meaning you choose to purchase those things, like a Sight Reading Factory membership, like some choir folders next year for your choir at mymusicfolders.com. You choose to buy some sheet music at ryanmain.com or graphitepublishing.com. Every time you enter the promo code Choralosophy at checkout at any of those vendors, you get 10% off. There's also Voce Vista Video, which is that overtone analyzing software that I geek out about so much. It is a must. Get it in time for school year next year to start. It is fantastic. You go to vocevistavideo.com/Choralosophy, and there you can download the software for free and play with it for 30 days. Once you decide you want to buy it, then you can enter in that Choral promo code. So that's just a little behind the scenes on how it all works. I appreciate everyone's help, and without you listeners doing your part to make this show happen, it just wouldn't happen. So thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoy the show. Yeah, no, absolutely. Because I remember as you were describing that, I was thinking back to one of my experiences as a kid that kind of makes this topic so interesting to me because, uh, you know, uh, I think you might remember this about me. I don't think my audience knows this, but my mom died when I was 17 and I was a senior in high school. And I remember one of the experiences that I had related to choir around that time was that my mom passed away in November of my senior year. I took a few days, off of school after she died, and did some stuff with family, and of course did the funeral stuff, and all of that. And but then I came back to school pretty quickly after that, and I remember one of my friends, and one of my choir friends, of course, came up to me after class after having come back, maybe 5 days or so, 3 or 4 days of school missed. And then I come back to school, and he pulled me aside. He's like, "Why are you here? How could you be here already? Like you should still be at home. Like how can you even be walking around right now after what just happened?" And I just remember thinking I needed to get to choir. Like this is where the choir is. And this is where I can come back into that space where I can contribute, where I can take my mind off of what's going on at home, and I can be in the community. And I didn't think about it until he asked me that at the time. Like I didn't think at the morning I got up for school that day that I need to get back to choir. It wasn't until someone asked me, "Why are you back at school?" And my answer was instantly that I needed to be back in the choir. And I didn't know it as a kid. I didn't know it that way. And so one of the things that I'm passionate about with this topic is that um, we choir was that for me. And I think that as choir directors, we have an obligation to create an environment where that can be that type of therapy for our students as well, and for our singers. And I always say students because that's where most of my focus goes, but I think this is true of adults too.
Absolutely.
I've had um, 80-year-old church choir members that need that therapy as well. Uh, I have had a church choir bass once. It was probably in his 90s. I think he was 92 by the time I left that church, where every single year the choir would take a break. And he's up in his 90s. They'd take a break in the summer, and I would get an email in the fall. Um, just wanted to let you know that I'm perfectly happy to sit out next year in choir if you feel like I'm too old to sing in the bass section. I know my eyesight's not what it was. And he would give this whole long list, and it would happen every year. and and of course my response was always, I want you to be here if this is where you want to be. And he said, I really would hate to give it up, but I also don't want to overstay my welcome, and blah blah blah. And so in that moment, I'm thinking, this man at his age still needs that community. He needs to be part of
Absolutely.
something. And I think that is the superpower that we exercise when we're in choir.
Yes, absolutely.
Mhm.
And so you were in referencing that story and referencing this gentleman and sort of what is that magic? What are some of the things that are happening? I found some parallels between what M. Scott Peck calls sort of the disciplines of suffering, the things that we do that help us suffer well. And as you know from the presentation I gave, as you sort of line these out, it's kind of amazing to see how some of these things are just totally completely natural and organic, and the part of our sort of our daily walk through music making in the ensemble setting, which was cool.
Yeah. Now, will you outline those ones for the audience?
Sure. So I'll outline them, and what's great is all the choral musicians out there listening to this, what you're immediately going to start lining up some things in your mind. Oh yes, this is what I do every day, or what we do every day. And so that's kind of the fun part of this, or the illuminating part of this. So the first skill that he talks about, the skill of discipline, that helps us suffer well, he calls delayed gratification. So he says this is the process by which you put the things you want to do after the things you don't want to do. And he says this is the only decent way to live. He says by doing so, you suffer first so that you experience the joy later, and the joy isn't sort of tempered by the fact that the suffering has not yet come, right? So we all understand this, and yet it is a thing that we do not like to do as humans sometimes, is to delay gratification. So clearly, as choral musicians, this is in everything we do, right? We walk into the first rehearsal, and unless my joke was sort of, unless your voce eight, your first rehearsal oftentimes doesn't sound very good, and it takes effort. You have to live with it. You have to earn your stripes through the rehearsal process. And yet through time, and with the help of friends, and with this group endeavor, and everybody helping each other up and picking each other up and keeping on going, you learn. And you get the reward later. Same thing with, I know you talk a lot about the sight singing that you do, how you establish that tough regimen at the beginning, and then somewhat quickly and surprisingly, the students start to see and experience the benefits of that. And then what the dividends that pays exponentially later on are enormous. And so they learn something incredible about delayed gratification and hard work up front. So that's one of the things. The other skill of and stop me anytime if you want to talk about
No,
anything.
go for it.
Another skill of discipline that helps us suffer well is acceptance of responsibility. And so one of the things I like about this is, and I would say that our bands and our orchestras experience this even more, but our singers come into the classroom and everybody's got to do their part and do their part right. They've got to match the vowel. They got to get the right pitch. They got to listen. And we're only as strong as, our weakest singers. And so, everybody has to accept responsibility for the role that they play in this group endeavor to reach the goal. And there's no one else to blame. And they're a part of a team, right? They have to do this. I always laugh, because right now, at least higher education institutions are very much into assessment, and we sort of have to qualify. Did your students actually learn anything this semester? And I always say, well, did you come to the concert and see, the 800 people stand up and give the standing ovation because, we gave a great concert? This is something we do really well. The third skill, and again, these are, I am using M. Scott Peck. These are M. Scott Peck's skills of discipline that help us learn to suffer well. And I'm applying them to sort of what we know about choral rehearsals and choral music making. And this one's called dedication to truth. This one's a little bit harder, but you were sort of getting at it here. Truth is one of those big enduring questions, right? It's a mystery. You can, as soon as somebody wants to try to define something as absolute truth, there's a philosopher or 100 philosophers that tell you, well, you're actually wrong. But maybe a way to think about this in a little bit more proactive way is to think of, if we consider what is truth, or what is it that really matters. And so I would suggest that in the choral rehearsal room, that space provides singers the opportunity to discover the difference between surface and substance. And that one of the great profound truths that I think our entire society and culture is suffering from is being able to understand what is surface and what is substance and what really matters, and to sort of be able to separate the wheat from the chaff of all the information that comes our way. Mm-hmm. And if I may, a lot of the people on the podcast will know Dr. Flemmerfelt, and this great book written by Donald Nally, Conversations with Joseph Flemmerfelt, sort of co-authored, if you will, by Donald Nally and Joseph Flemmerfelt. And he really gets at this, and he talks about many people mistake surface for substance, which is a cultural affliction of our time that affects the education of musicians. Consider schools of music high-powered schools that turn out instrumentalists who play with great virtuosity and great brilliance. And you say, okay, it's kind of impressive, but now what? And singers, good Lord, I call certain ones sound machines, people with extraordinary voices who pay thousands and thousands of dollars to develop their voices, but seem to stay focused on the sound and fail to connect with what motivates musically, right? And so no one has led them to understand the truth, whether in music or in life, that it flows from the inside out, not the other way around. And then Donald Nally says, well, Marcel Proust wrote, our vanity, our passions, our spirit of imitation, our abstract intelligence, our habits have long been at work, and it is the task of art to undo this work of theirs, making us travel back in the direction from which we have come to the depths where what has really existed lies unknown within us. And that's sort of the brilliant thing. It's really kind of the choral rehearsal room where you have that, again, that sort of indescribable magic that is truly palpable, and it provides something, this understanding, hey, this is not a show, this is not tricks and gimmicks, this is really something of substance, something really profound has happened here. And it's a little hard to describe it, a little hard to put your thumb on it, and yet anybody who's been in there knows it, and then they know how to take that out into the world and recognize surface and substance out there. It's a really, I think, a wonderful tool that we provide for our students. And then finally, the last one is balancing. And balancing is this ability to continually strike and restrike a balance between all the forces at work that cause you to stumble and experience pain and deal with it. And it's here where I suggest students learn less from the act of music making, but more from observing the teacher. And so they observe us sometimes really, really suffer at the decisions we have to make for the sake of our programs on their behalf, the long hours we keep, sometimes choosing to be with them instead of going home to be with our kids or watch a baseball game, or, they see us. They see us invested in them to the degree that we suffer, constantly trying to deal with this balance. One of them is sort of home and life, right? Or work and home, that balance. And so they see us suffer. And by seeing us suffer and seeing that we're willing to do it on their behalf, they learn that suffering must be okay as well. And so all these things are provided within the context of the choral rehearsal space that I would suggest are not readily available in other subjects. And I know people will say, well, athletics brings a lot of this, and I would agree. But one of the things that is different is athletics always has a competitive component. If it's a team sport, it's sort of us against them, and how are we better than them? If it's an individual sport, it's sort of what is my best, and can I sort of beat my best? Can I continually improve? But to create this space for something where we are using these skills within a group setting where everyone has to be lifted, that is something truly, truly unique. And what we provide for our students through that process, I think, is just incredible and wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think, though, the comparison to athletics is interesting because you're right. It does supply some of those needed things, but not all of them. In that, in fact, I would even say, don't want to offend any of our band and orchestra type colleagues, but it's even true when we're speaking about instrumental music, because in choral music we get to deal with the text,
Right.
and when we get to deal with the text of the religious ideas, the philosophical ideas, the poetic ideas, the expressions of love, anguish, all those things we've talked about, that that only in that type of a setting are you really dealing with the broad human experience. I had a recent episode with Vince Peterson where he was talking about the idea of whether or not Palestrina and Kanye both have something to say that is the same as each other, and whether or not we can, if we can't get our students to be able to see that Palestrina and Kanye might have something universal and human that they would both need to say through their art, then we're kind of not doing our jobs. Which is all artists express these things in different ways, and in choral music we get to kind of dig into those texts and kind of hear them express it in their own words through their musical language, but they're also their written word. So I do think that we win. We
We win.
we are the
We
superior art
win
form.
that like in athletics. Yeah. I mean, I will totally agree with that, because when you think about it, our students, look, I could get really nerdy here. When you go back in the history of sacred music, the parts of the Bible that were originally supposed to be sung are the Psalms, and the Psalms are filled with every kind of emotion. It's
Mhm.
not sort of your namby pamby soporific, just whatever. I mean, this is the music that our students get to sing. They get to express love, loss, death, tragedy, violence, illness, frailty, rage, joy, desolation, hurt, confusion, and on and on and on. And it is incredible that we provide them a space to sort of experience um, all of these, so that they can, sort of work them out, even if it's in sort of an objective and somewhat detached way at first. It leaves those channels open so that they are more human, more vulnerable, more perceptive. And M. Scott Peck says, in sort of, ultimately, we guide them to one of life's greatest secrets. It is that in the giving up of one's self that human beings find the most ecstatic and lasting, solid, durable joy of life. And it is death that provides life with all of its meaning. And this is the central wisdom of religion. But we give them access to these things that are profound in ways that they can't really do in any other subjects. And I think we're filling a void for them that is critical for mental health. It is critical for mental health.
Yeah. Yeah, because you could say a casual observer listening to this might say, well, students or young people or any person can engage with all those things you just listed, the rage and the love and the fear and all those things, by watching movies about those things. We could just watch movies about those things, and that'll take care of it. But what I would suggest in that instance is that the unique thing about choral music is that when we are dealing with those topics with singers, and when they are engaging with them, they are engaging them with them repetitively. They are coming back to that song. So they're coming back to their choir rehearsal 3 days a week or 5 days a week or whatever it is. And they're going to step back into that mindset. They're going to step back into that text. They're going to step back into that person's expression. They're going to take it off. They're going to go about their life. They're going to see how that interacts with the rest of their life. And then they're going to come back tomorrow and they're going to engage with it again. So they're going to be layering it over and over and over. And it becomes part of who we are. It becomes part of how we see the world. And I think we underestimate, even those of us who are choral musicians, I think sometimes underestimate the psychological power of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so let's do one more nerdy topic before we're done. You also in your presentation talked about this word I had never heard of, which is cathexis.
Yes.
It sounds dirty, but tell us about what cathexis is.
Okay. Cathexis is this pretty cool word, because, and this is one that always drives my college students crazy, because it helps us discern sort of the difference between kind of the mad rush of adrenaline and hormones that is falling in love, and what it means to sort of really connect, reach out, and invest in a person or object that actually, is not falling in love, that is something greater than that. And so um M. Scott Peck's book it's pretty cool. The first about 77 pages are about suffering, and then the rest of the book is about love, as if suffering is sort of a precursor to love. And so he says we've got to we want to talk about love. We want to try and understand what this is, but in order to do it, we've got to understand suffering. I think that's symbolic. And what he says is, so where does love come to play in this? We've got delayed gratification, acceptance of responsibility, dedication to truth, and balancing. Those are those skills for suffering. And he says the strength and energy and willingness to use these techniques are provided by love. And so I'm going to get to your term cathexis here in a moment. So he defines love as this: the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth. And
Which is
I
what we
just
do
like
in
to
choir.
pause. I just like to pause right there and sort of say, that's being a choral director. I think that's why we all got into this. I mean, I suppose there are a few of us out there who got into it because we want fame and fortune.
Right.
Sure.
For the Benjamins.
Right. And so, but look, really, when we think about this creating music and investing all this time in a group of people, we're really trying to extend ourselves out for this purpose, this thing out there. So again, I'm leading up to cathexis because you got to kind of lead up to it, and it takes a little time. So love is not falling in love, right? And so our American culture and all of its Disney wonder is built on this idea that we just sort of fall in love and happily ever after, and despite the harsh reality of the world, which constantly breaches this fantasy, we hold on to it like, please, this falling in love has to be the real it. But in contrast, psychologists use this word cathexis, and it's similar to falling in love, but it's the thing that provides the long-lasting, true, more significant thing. And so M. Scott Peck defines cathexis as this: when we extend our limits through love, we do so by reaching out, so to speak, toward the beloved, whose growth we wish to nurture. For us to be able to do this, the beloved object must first become the beloved to us. In other words, we must be attracted toward, invested in, and committed to an object outside of ourselves, beyond the boundaries of self. Psychiatrists call this process cathexis.
Mm-hmm.
And what at the Choralosophy conference, I read out of the book where he gives an example of a man who's cathected to his garden. He wakes up early on Sundays. He neglects his wife to work in his garden. He invests in fertilizers and soils. He loves his flowers. He thinks about their future. He protects them from, the spring freeze that comes. In other words, there is this investment. It's a verb. It's an extension of oneself, whereas falling in love takes sort of no effort. You just sort of fall, right? It's sort of a hormonal thing, biological thing that happens. And so we want to differentiate that, because when our students come to choir, they come to choir because they are developing a cathexis. They are finding something that nourishes them. They extend themselves toward it. It becomes a beloved object. They nurture it, the group and the music, both together. They invest, and then it pays them back tenfold in wonderful dividends of beauty, relationship, and again, all this understanding that we've talked about. And the magic is that they learn what that's like, what it means to cathect with something that is of substance, that matters. And then they learn to apply it in other parts of their lives, and they become what I will sort of call modern day sages. They become these really sort of powerfully spiritually enlightened people because they know what it means to participate in this group cathexis endeavor of music making. It really is something incredibly unique and wonderful. And they get there, they achieve this through the disciplines of suffering. They learn the appropriate ways to cathect to something of value. And so I just don't think you find this practically anywhere else, especially in the educational environment. So this idea that in many public schools across the America, parochial schools, private schools, that we would continue to invest in this kind of endeavor, I think it's a great investment. It needs to continue. I know I'm preaching to the choir, no pun intended, but there is something I think even more profound than I had been willing to acknowledge over a certain number of years, and that I've learned through this book and through sort of engaging in this discussion with my students at Pepperdine.
Yeah, it's one thing, and on the way out, I just want to kind of share this anecdote, which is that on that topic of involving these types of conversations within the education system, I have talked to high school students about this pet peeve of mine for years, which is that in high school, we often get put in a role of, kids come to school, and at school, we're going to teach them about not drinking and driving, and we're going to teach them about mental health, and we're going to have some teacher talk to them about suicide issues and sex ed, as you mentioned before. And the way we deliver it is that I meet with about 20 kids that I do not know, who are in my like homeroom that's been assigned to me, and we give get a curriculum that I did not write, and I get to talk to them about their feelings that day, about drinking or about suicide or whatever, and it's an absolute waste of time. It's a complete waste of time because they don't know me. And then I bring up to my choir kids that have gone through this cathexis process with me, and have experienced that vulnerability for years and years. And I say, what if we had these conversations in choir? And their eyes get big every single time. Oh my goodness, that would be so helpful. Like, but then I get frustrated that I don't think I would be supported having those real authentic conversations in choir, because it's not what we're there for,
Mhm.
right? But the problem is, if we decide that in school we need these things, then I think that they need to be had in environments where some type of cathexis has occurred between the people that are there. And I think, for example, that doesn't have to be the choir teacher. It could be, for some kids, it could be the baseball coach.
Mhm.
For some kids, it could be the guidance counselor, but I doubt it because I don't see them very often. It could be the home ec teacher, and that kid just is really into those types of things, and so they're always in that class, right? And so kids that get really, really invested in something like our kids do in choral music, they are more likely to want to dig deep into some of these things.
I oftentimes sort of drop my jaw at the fact that in that cathexis environment, the way in which the walls have come down and the ways in which the channels have been opened in which to reach sort of the deepest levels of communication and touch on the broadest spectrum of the human experience, it's sort of staggering. And what you can accomplish with the people who've been involved in that together, the level of trust and the history that you've created. I think you're touching on something really um, at the crux of this,
Mhm.
and that is that if we're really going to be involved in education that makes a difference, I would suggest that choral music is at the forefront, not even just a part of it, but in fact at the forefront.
Mhm.
And that trying to figure out how to create these kinds of experiences for the greater student body, I know that would be a really interesting challenge, but considering how to do that would be a really unique and interesting educational endeavor. Um,
Absolutely.
Chris, I wonder if I can. We started off with talking about suffering, and when I gave this little talk at Choralosophy, I was thinking a lot about this past year and the degree to which we've all suffered as choral directors, as musicians. And one of the reasons I wanted to give this talk was to give the choral directors a chance to sort of chew on their own suffering and to acknowledge that it's worth something, that it has meaning. And I thought I'd leave with that last quote that I have on the slides, if
Absolutely.
the
Go for
slide,
it.
if that's appropriate. So it
Yeah.
says, and so choral directors out there, we're talking about you here, right? So spiritually evolved people, by virtue of their discipline, mastery, and love, are people of extraordinary competence. And in their competence, they are called on to serve the world, and in their love, they answer the call. They are inevitably, therefore, people of great power, although the world may generally behold them as quite ordinary people, since more often than not, they will exercise their power in quiet or even hidden ways, Nonetheless, exercise power they do, and in this exercise, they suffer greatly. So
That's
really,
awesome.
really awesome words by M. Scott Peck.
That's awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Board. That was an awesome conversation. And of course, I could do it all day, but I really appreciate the insight. And I think people are going to get something out of this.
Well, I appreciate the invitation, and I love talking about this stuff as well. It's fun to nerd out on all things choral and beyond, especially with you. So my best to you as you head into the summer, and thanks for the opportunity.
All right. Have a good night.
You too. Take care.
All right. Thank you, as always, for tuning in to an episode and sticking with it all the way to the end. The ones who hear my outro message are the real MVPs of the show. So I will remind you that if you are sticking around this far, that means you have some value that you are finding in the show. And so do me some favors. There are ways that you can help. As I mentioned earlier in the episode, you heard about ways that you can support the show financially through Patreon or through using the promo code. But even if that's not a possibility for you, it helps me a ton when people share, when people comment, when people ask questions, when people drive the conversation so that it continues to beat the algorithms of social media and put good, healthy conversations in front of choral people and people in general. And so anytime you interact with the show, it helps a lot. So things like leaving ratings in podcast apps, on Facebook itself, you can go to the Choralosophy podcast page on Facebook, like it, leave a rating, tell people it's cool, because then more people will see it and more people will join the conversation. Of course, there are also the formal communication forums like Choralosopher's Facebook page, so join over there if you're not yet. And you can also just send me an email, choralosophy@gmail.com. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody. See you next time.